Not all stories are told in daylight. Here we tell you the stories they warn you not to repeat, and the ones they pray aren't true. There are some places people aren't meant to live in for long, where the trees grow too close, winter stays long after the calendar says it's gone. Tonight's stories all come from those kinds of places. 3 accounts of isolation, hunger, things that could hunt in the cold. Settle in and keep your lights low. These are the stories of the Wendigo. I live at the bend where the gravel gives up trying to be a road and turns into 2 ruts through scrub and alder. My mailbox leans, my porch sags. I've got 3 dogs in a habit of doing the same things at the same time every day, which is the closest thing to a religion I've managed in middle age. Their names are Gus, Maple and Finch, an old shepherd mix with a grey muzzle and opinions, a barrel-chested yellow mutt who thinks the world is hers to greet, and a lean, nervous black dog that came home with me from the shelter and never quite figured out how to relax. They circle me in the mornings while the kettle climbs towards a whistle, and the wood stoves shake off last night's ash. We walk the fence. I check the traps on the compost so the raccoons don't enjoy a buffet. It's the same every day. And every day until this winter, she walked by. I never knew her name. She was just the woman with the green coat and the red knit cap, a tidy pair of boots, and that canvas tote you see on the farmer's market Sundays. She came from the direction of the lake road and headed towards the old mission, moving with purpose but not speed. She always smiled at the dogs, even when they barked the first week, and she had the same greeting each time. "Good morning, handsome," she'd say to Gus because he'd pressed the fence line like a cop on patrol. And "God bless you," to Mabel, who'd slam her whole body into a wag. Finch would keep a deliberate distance. She'd angle her face just enough to include him. "And you too, little shadow." The first time she said it, "God bless you," Mabel sneezed so hard she startled herself. I laughed. The woman laughed too. Hand on the tote bag, cap pulled down against the wind. "I've always liked dogs better than people," she confided through the slats. "But don't tell the people." Routine does something to you out here. When your nearest neighbour is a half-mile through trees and your phone only works if you press your cheek to the kitchen window, the little human moments become load-bearing. The woman's walk happened between 7:45 and 8, depending on the weather. If I was late to stoke the stove, the bark would tell me. If I was early with a coffee, I'd step onto the porch and watch her hat crest the bend like a cardinal on the snow. I waved, she waved, dogs grinned the way only dogs can, and the day began. As the fall slipped towards winter, the times drifted. Sunrise came meaner later. Frost stuck in weeds like sugar. One morning she came at 9. Another day I was halfway through splitting around and heard her voice float up through the quiet, then turned to find her not at the fence but a dozen yards down, walking slower than usual. It was the first time I thought she looked tired. Not weak, just thinner somehow. Coat looser on her frame. "Running late?" I asked, performing neighbourly as a reflex. "It's what you do when the world narrows. Come small on purpose, so you don't start bumping into your own edges." She smiled, but there was a pause before it landed. "The cold makes a coward out of me," she said, patting the tote. "But someone still needs their bread." "Want a coffee to take with you?" I offered. "That's kind," she said. And that same soft laugh, but didn't stop at the gate. She kept moving, slow and steady, the tote bumping her hip. "God bless you," she added to Mabel, and then turning her face just enough to catch Finch. "Little shadow." The way she said "little shadow" hung with me after she rounded the bend. The timing of it, like she was practicing the rhythm of a song she knew from memory but had to find again. Things are small in winter. The world closes in. You get sensitive to any change. The next week, I realised my coffee was usually lukewarm by the time she passed. She'd begun coming not that morning, but closer to noon, and then later. 2 days in a row she didn't come at all. I told myself I wouldn't stand at the window waiting. Nobody wants to become a man pacing his own kitchen, but I watched the road anyway. The dogs watched harder. They started sitting at the fence line around the time she used to appear, not barking, just waiting. Even Finch, he'd place his paws on the same 2 divots and stare at the bend with the intensity he usually reserved for thunderstorms. When she finally came again, late afternoon, a pale smear of sun dragging through low cloud, Mabel whined before she'd even crested the hill. A keening sound I'd never heard from her. The woman's coat looked darker, wet maybe. The red cap was gone. Her hair was slicked back like wind had combed it flat and left it. She walked in that same steady line, tote on her hip, eyes focused somewhat level with my shoulder. When she reached the fence, Gus didn't bark. He stepped back. He's never stepped back from anything other than a skunk. "Afternoon," I said. "You okay out there?" She tipped her head the way she always did. The smile came a heartbeat late, as if someone had hit play on a recording. "Good morning, handsome," she told Gus in a voice that sounded like hers pulled through a long pipe, thin and far away. To Mabel, she said it again. "God bless you." The syllable sat in the air like frost. Finch stayed behind my knee. She turned her face to the precise degree she always had, and made the shape his name might be without forming it. "You sure you don't want a coffee?" I tried again, thinking of a warm mug, door cracked, the way steam would make coal feel like a day you'd won. My breath clouded in front of me. Hers didn't. She started, mouth working around the word the way you work a tooth with your tongue when it's finally loose. "I can't stop." "Okay," I said, like I had suddenly become a man who talked people on the other side of fences and meant the word as permission. "Okay." She moved on. The dogs watched her go all the way to the bend. The sky went early dark. I told myself the way her mouth had shaped the blessing was just the cold. The next morning was a whiteout. By noon the plough had not bothered. I pulled on my boots and headed down to the mailbox. My neighbour was there in a red pickup with the heat blasting and 2 kids asleep in the back like lumps under quilts. He lived at the far end where the rut vanishes into cedar. "Road's a sheet past the mission," he called through a cracked window, one hand on the wheel like it was the only thing keeping his truck from flying away. "Figures," I said. We did the exchange you do when there's weather. A shared complaint makes an instant friendship. I asked about his eldest hockey game. He asked if I needed salt. Before he drove on, he mentioned a search party. "For who?" I asked. "The old gal who goes by here with a tote," he said, waving vaguely towards the lake road. "Green coat. Folks from St. Pius all over checking the trails off the river. She's been gone since, hell, I don't know, a week and a half. Family never showed for Christmas. Sister called the department." I must have made a face. He looked at me like I'd just eaten a lemon. "What?" he said. "I saw her yesterday," I said, the words falling wrong out of my mouth. They sounded too loud in the cold. "She came by, around 4. Walked this way, to tell her the dogs. She was..." I wanted to say odd, but odd carries judgment, so I didn't want to make. She was quiet. He stared at me. His eyes had that sharp winter squint. The heat from the truck breathed out the cracked window and wrapped my face in a warmth that felt borrowed. One of the kids flopped an arm free and turned their face into the seat back. "You sure?" he asked in a voice that meant he hoped it was true. "Sure," I said. The way he watched me made me repeat it like a prayer. "I'm sure." He drove away with a crunch that sounded like someone stepping on the edge of a pane of glass. I stood a while longer and then realised I'd been staring at the tracks leading nowhere, my boots making 2 oval holes in the skin of the snow, and no smaller ones beyond. Like someone had walked up to my fence and not left any trace but the fact of my reaction. That night, just after dark, the dogs began circling. There's a particular pace dogs have when they've realised something the humans haven't. Gus marked his patrol route, shouldering my leg each time he made a turn. Mabel parked her weight at the door and breathed hard like she was about to make a decision and wanted everyone to witness it. Finch threaded himself through the kitchen like a needle pulling black thread. I heard it before they did. The quiet you think is silence until you notice the normal noises are missing. Snow hushes a place anyway, but this was more than snow. It was the absence of the world's mindless churn. No stove tick, no kettle groan. Even the old clock above the sink seemed to hold its breath. Then, Mabel's head snapped to the window. I keep a lamp in the corner by the table. It made a circle on the glass and my reflection sat in it like someone else's life. Beyond it the porch was a grey slice with drift against the rail. A shape stood by the gate. Coat dark, hair darker. The angle of the shoulders that had walked this road every day for years and knew exactly how to hold themselves. She was where she always was when she said good morning. She shouldn't have been there. The dogs didn't bark at first. They pressed against the glass as if it would suddenly be water they could swim through. Mabel made a whining sound again, pitched low and urgent, the sound of a ceiling fan wobbling before bolt breaks. Gus's hackles rose so high he seemed two dogs stacked. Finch lowered himself until his belly brushed the floor, a soldier learning how to disappear into dirt. I told myself to wait. I told myself not to open the door. I told myself a lot of things that sounded like orders and felt like wishes. The woman raised a hand and placed it on the top rail of the gate. She didn't squeeze the wood or brace herself. She just set it there. Fingers splayed like she was testing temperature. In the lamp's reflection I could see my own face ghosted over hers. For half a second I had the animal impulse to kill the light so I could see her eyes, and the human impulse to turn every light on so nothing had shadows to hide in. I didn't either. Her mouth moved. The first time she said it, the words fell out of her like something she'd stored in her throat too long and they'd gone stale. Good morning, handsome. It was wrong, twice timed wrong for night and balanced wrong for on her breath. Each syllable slurred slightly towards the next as if she'd pulled them from one long word and hadn't figured out where to cut. Gus stepped backward until his rump hit my shin. She said it again, louder. Good morning, handsome. The second time, it sounded like my voice pitched up and dragged. She turned her face towards the porch, not towards the window where I stood, but towards a space a person would be standing if they had come outside. God bless you. She told no one. The way the consonants landed made my teeth ache. It was like hearing a recording of a prayer played backwards. The shape of it familiar with the sense evacuated. God bless you. God bless you. Mabel barked then, the deep, full bark she saves for coyotes and drunken snowmobilers. The woman's head jerked towards the sound as if she'd been waiting to locate it. She took a step forward. Her boots didn't sink. The tote hung from her hand like it was heavier now than it had any right to be. She was closer when she said it next time. God bless you. And the S's hissed like steam on metal. I reached for my phone and knocked it off the table with the same hand. It hit the floor face down and skittered under the chair. She walked into the porch light. There's a quality when something is wearing a shape it doesn't own. You see it in thrift stores sometimes. The way a suit drapes close enough to pass until you notice the seam riding wrong on the shoulder. Her coat hung that way. The line of it didn't match the bones underneath. It was not grotesque. It was not monstrous. It was just misaligned. As if whoever had put it on had done so in a hurry and then forgotten which parts a human needed to convince you. She reached the bottom step and stopped. God bless you, she said again. The sound of the words filled the room without touching the air, like something played inside your head. Dogs went off in a tangle. Mabel hit the door with both paws. Finch spun in a tight circle, nails skittering. Gus put himself between me and the window like he had every plan from here on out, and I just needed to shut up and let him do it. Then, everything stopped. I don't mean the dogs chose to be quiet. I mean their bodies continued to move, but the sound didn't come. Mabel's mouth opened on a bark that had no bark in it. Finch's nails hit wood and made no noise. Gus's growl collapsed into the kind of nothing that makes your ears ring with the effort of trying to find a sound that's not there. Silence laid itself over the house like a weight. The woman lifted her foot to the first stair. The toe of the boot hovered just above the wood. She held it there, as if checking whether the stair would consent to be stepped on. Then, in the absence of noise, I heard another sound. Something like breath, but not from a mouth. More like air being moved by a large thing in a small place. Not a gasp, not a sigh. The space in front of the door grew warmer by a degree so small it should not have a name, and yet my skin knew it. The doorknob turned. I had not unlocked it. It turned as if the notion of locked had been removed from it the way a word taken out of a sentence leaves behind the shape of what it used to be there. The latch whispered back without sound. The door opened slowly, not with drama, not the way a movie would make it go for a scare. It opened like a person opens a door to a room they know well, careful not to wake the sleeping. The porch was empty. The woman with the green coat was not visible in the frame of the doorway. Gus leaned forward until his nose touched the line between inside air and outside air, and froze there like a statue carved in the exact instant before movement. Mabel's tail went high and still. Finch flattened his ears so hard they seemed to disappear into his skull. I did not tell them to stay. I could not have asked them to do anything and expected a response. There's a kind of fear that doesn't take orders. Then a smell came in. Not rot, not copper. Something thinner and sadder, like cold bread. A voice spoke from the threshold. Not loud, not whispered. It came as if from 5 inches to my left ear, even though no one stood there. The house carried it like an old woman carries a heavy bag, slowly, with care. It said the words it had always said. God bless you. My dogs went to ground at the exact same time, 3 bodies lowering as one organism. Their eyes did not leave the door. I could feel their bones pressed into my shins through denim. There were a few honest decisions in a moment like that. Most of what you do is what you were already going to do because of who you've been becoming every day leading up to it. I'm the kind of man who keeps one key in the lock and the second on a nail. I'm the kind of man who says the name of a thing out loud when he knows he shouldn't. I'm the kind of man who hesitates one heartbeat too long when something asks for forgiveness in a voice it learnt from listening. Ma'am? I said, and then realised what I had done, given it a shape to stand in. The space between us thickened. The cold outside pressed on the warm inside like a face against glass. God bless you, the voice said again. And this time, it sounded like 3 voices interleaved, the words not in agreement about when they started or ended. Somewhere in the layer underneath, something made the noise a stomach makes when it's been emptied too long. I felt it more than heard it. Far off, down towards the bend, a siren chirped. It cut through the quiet and then went out, smothered by the night. The dog's ears twitched towards it and then back. The door moved another inch. I thought of the neighbour's truck heat curling from the window. I thought of the tote bumping a hip. I thought of Mabel sneezing the first time she'd been blessed. I thought about the way people disappear out here. One day you run your route, the next day the cold is taller than you, and you make a choice you think will make you warmer. Please, I said before I knew to whom I was speaking. The voice that answered wasn't the woman's, or mine, or any voice a throat could make and still be a throat. It came from the door frame itself, from the boards, from the place in the wall where heat lives. It was not angry, it was not kind. It was hungry in a way that felt like winter. Let me bless them, it said so soft I might have invented it just to justify what came next. Gus lifted his lip enough to show one good tooth. Finch's body trembled so hard it seemed like a series of small quakes passing under the floor. Mabel leaned into me until my knee locked. I don't remember closing the door. I remember that it was closed. I remember my hand on wood. I remember the shape of the coal pressing itself flat against the other side. I remember the sound of nothing, louder than anything I've ever heard. I stood there with my palm on the door and counted to 30 out loud. When I reached 30, the house exhaled the way a person does when they realize they can. The clock over the sink ticked once. From far off came the honest noise of tyres losing a fight with drift and then finding purchase. The dogs stayed pressed to me. The weight of their bodies was the most truthful thing in the world. I kept my post by the door until the coffee went cold in the pot twice. Sometime after midnight, a search team's lights swung along the burn by the bend. Long slabs of illumination like hands passing over a face. Voices called a name I still do not know. The dogs lifted their heads but did not move. No one knocked. The next morning the snow wore new tracks I couldn't read, edges blurred by wind as if someone had been circling the fence line all night but had learnt how to step in their own holes so the count would be off. 2 days later, the neighbour stopped again in his red truck. He didn't crack the window this time. He opened the door and stood on the running board with both boots like he decided he needed to stance for balance. "They found her," he said. "Where?" I asked, even though the answer didn't matter. "South of the river, not far. Strange thing is, the coroner says she's been out there at least a week. Might be more. The cold kept her, you know." He looked at the dogs with the soft eyes a man gets when he thinks of his children asleep and wants to stay in that thought for a little longer. She had bread in her tote, frozen like a brick. He waited for me to say the part where I told him I must have been mistaken. He waited with the patience of a man who knows there's comfort in being wrong together. I didn't give it to him. Later, after he drove off and the day narrowed back to its regular size, I took the kettle off the stove and watched the steam unwind. Gus set his head on my knee like an apology. Mabel found a patch of sun on the floorboards and occupied it like her job. Finch lay with his spine pressed against the bottom of the door as if he could hold the house closed with his bones. I keep thinking about the way her greeting changed. A blessing is a simple thing until it's said by something that doesn't understand what it's for. Then it becomes a shape you can step into to make yourself look like you belong. We teach the wild how to ask in our language, and then we're surprised when it knocks. People will tell you the Wendigo is a story to keep men from eating each other in winter. They will draw antlers where none belong and make it into a trophy you can pin to a wall. I don't know what the word is for the thing that came to my door and learned how to say "God bless you" in a voice that made my dog step backward. I only know hunger when I hear it. She doesn't walk by anymore. The dogs watch the bend anyway. Some afternoons when the sky is low and the road is a white tongue laid out flat, a shadow will stand for a while by the gate. And then the light will shift and it will be only air again. Sometimes at night I wake with my hand lifted, palm open, as if I've been counting without numbers and ran out of better things to do. And sometimes, as the house cools and the stove makes its smaller settling sound, I hear a voice at the edge of the room say the old line in a tone that has finally learned where syllables live. "God bless you," it says once, soft, earnest. The dogs do not bark. They rise together, bones and breath and the honesty of animals, and stand facing the door without making a sound. I do the same. Evan had worked night security for 15 years. Factories, schools, shopping centres. The monastery job was supposed to be easy. The monastery sat halfway up a ridge north of an old fort, a weather-beaten stone relic left to rot until a heritage trust began restoration work. For now, it was empty, except for scaffolding, power cables, and Evan. He was hired to watch the place at night, mostly to make sure no kids or hikers slipped inside. It was the kind of job he liked, quiet, out of the way, no one breathing down his neck. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. The wind rolled down the ridge in a long, heavy gust that rattled the old window frames. The heating worked upstairs, but the air in the crypt level was colder, thick and damp like the walls were sweating. He made a note about it in the logbook and didn't think much more of it. The crypt had been reopened just weeks ago. The lower chambers had caved in during the 50s, killing several workers, so the site stayed sealed until now. The crew hadn't gone far, just the top passage, setting up scaffolds and sensors. The deeper levels were still blocked off by a heavy iron gate. On the second night, a motion sensor pinged at 1:43 a.m. Evan looked at the monitor. The camera feed showed the far end of the crypt hallway, empty, just dust in the air floating in the flashlight beams from his rounds earlier. He went down anyway. The stone steps groaned under his boots. The air temperature dropped with each step, a cold so sharp it made his breath sting. He scanned the hall with his torch. Nothing. Then he saw the marks. Scratches in the mortar near the sealed section, 4 at a time, straight, deep, clean through old stone. Dust from the grooves still clung to the wall. He stared for a moment, then rubbed his hands along the nearest one. The edges crumbled like fresh plaster. Something had done that recently. He logged it and went back up. His radio crackled faintly as he climbed. Static mixed with what sounded like breathing, so he switched it off. By the third night, a snowstorm had moved in. The ridge road iced over before dark. The radio was useless. The lights flickered at midnight and never came back full strength. The monitors in the security office buzzed, lines of static rolling through the feeds. He saw movement, once. A tall figure gliding past the north corridor. A flash, then gone. He rewound the feed 3 times. The same shape appeared for a frame or two. Hunched, thin. Too tall to be human. The timestamp glitched. Evan sat there for a long minute before pulling on his coat and taking the flashlight again. The descent into the crypt felt longer this time. The deeper he went, the thicker the air became. Heavy, almost oily. Every breath felt cold enough to burn. At the bottom, the door to the sealed section was open. Not all the way, just enough for a gap. Dust coated the floor, and something wet had spread across the stone, dark and faintly reflective. He squatted down. The moisture had frozen around the edges, forming tiny frost veins that caught the light. It smelled of rot and iron. Something shifted behind the door. A low scrape, stone against stone. Evan froze. Then the flashlight flickered and died. For a few seconds there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing. Then something exhaled back, long and hollow. He turned and ran. The cold followed him up the steps. A wall of air made his eyes water. When he reached the top, he slammed the door and locked it. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys. The next day, he told the site supervisor about the breach. The man brushed it off, said pressure changes from the storm could have cracked the seal. He told Evan to check the lower camera at night, make sure it wasn't condensation. That night, the storm came back harder. The generator cut once before midnight. At 1:15 in the morning, the motion sensors lit up one by one. From the farthest point of the crypt, moving towards the stairs. Evan watched the red dots on the monitor as they blinked in sequence. Then the lower corridor camera flickered. Something stepped into the frame. It filled the passage, its body thin and colourless, its joints bent wrong. The light caught the side of its face, pale skin stretched tight over bone, mouth open too wide. The feed cut out. Evan grabbed the flashlight and the service pistol from the desk drawer. The hallway outside the office hummed with power failure, no light, no sound, but the generator's dying pulse. He crept towards the stairwell. Halfway down, the cold hit him again, thick and heavy. The beam of his flashlight cut through haze. The air looked alive with dust or snow, though nothing was falling. He reached the bottom landing and froze. The open door swayed gently, even though there was no wind. The smell was stronger now, meat and wet stone. Something moved behind the columns ahead, a slow, dragging step, and another. He steadied his hands with the flashlight, beam shook across the walls, caught the edge of something tall. It stopped, turned its head. Eyes like pits reflected the light, catching it just enough to shine dull silver. Its chest moved once, a breath that sounded like a groan. Then it came forward. Evan fired twice. The sound ripped through the crypt and vanished like it hit water. The thing didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. He turned and ran. The steps felt endless. His boots slipped on frost that had crept up the stairs. Behind him, something scraped along the wall, slow but steady. He reached the landing, shoved through the door and ran for the office. The lights above flickered on for half a second, showing a thin trail of frost following him up the hallway. He slammed the office door shut and wedged the chair under the handle. His chest burned from the cold. His breath came out white. The monitors were dead, all except one, the stairwell feed. Through the static he saw the figure climbing. The camera shook, though nothing was touching it. At the edge of the frame, fingers, long, dark, jointed like branches, slid over the last step. Evan backed away, eyes fixed on the screen. Then the power went out, completely. He waited in the dark, hand on the pistol, counting every second. The generator's heartbeat, the wind outside, the scrape on the other side of the wall. The scrape stopped. The soft tapping began at the glass of the office window. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. He turned towards the sound and saw a shape behind the frosted pane. Tall enough to fill it, pressed close enough that the surface began to freeze. The frost spread outward in veins, crawling across the window and along the frame of the door. The handle moved once, twice, then stopped. Silence. Evan stayed frozen in place until dawn's light bled faint through the snow outside. When the restoration crew arrived, they found the power back on for the office empty. The monitors were looping static. The coffee in the mug beside the chair had frozen solid. The last camera feed, timestamped at 3:17 a.m., showed the flashlight beam in the crypt corridor trembling, jerking sideways, and then vanishing into black. 2 days later, the crypt was sealed again. The workers said the air below was colder than ever. Cold enough to leave frost on the stone even while the boilers upstairs ran full. The door to the lower section bore new welds, deep and dark, and near the bottom edge of the metal, faintly pressed into the frosts, were handprints. 5 fingers each, long, uneven, pressed from the inside. John came home in late August, when the calves were old enough to wander, and fences needed more wire than talk. His father had taken pneumonia hard that spring and never got his wind back. The ranch he came home to wasn't big. 200 head if you counted stubborn steers twice, but it was isolated. The gravel road ran out a mile before the property line, and the pine forest pressed close on 3 sides like a wall. The layout was simple. House on the rise, barn, and feed shed below it. A long rectangle of pasture stretching towards the timber, and a windbreak of poplar along the east fence. 2 heelers, Scout and Brim, slept on the porch by day and patrolled as far as the gate by night. The old diesel generator sat on a cinder block pad behind the barn and rattled when the main line flickered, which was often. On John's first night back, he checked the north fence with a toolbox and a headlamp. Coyotes had worried a calf the week before, so he walked the line slow. The wire sagged in a few places. One post was scored with deep scratches near the top staple, 4 straight grooves running through the old wood. He ran his thumb over the marks, fresh. The dogs stayed 10 yards back, hackles up, noses pointed at the tree line. Cougar, his father had said when John mentioned it over coffees. We've had one drifting through since June. Shoot near it, that'll be enough. The old man coughed into a towel and waved him towards the door. Leave the porch light on. Dogs won't range if you shut it off. The first 2 nights settled into a pattern. Check the generator fuel, check the gates, scan the pasture with the rifle over his shoulder. Motion lights along the fence blinked to life when he crossed their cones and died as he moved past. He could hear the herd breathing when the wind dropped, slow, steady, 100 animals shifting their weight. Just before 2, the second night, the dogs lifted their heads and stared north. John killed his headlamp and listened. Nothing moved. No crickets in the grass, no breeze turning the poplars. The quiet spread out in a circle, clean-edged and too neat. The dogs didn't bark, they just stared. After a minute, they put their heads back down and pretended to sleep. John finished his walk with a tight feeling under his ribs and didn't log anything but fixes. 1 loose staple, 2 cracked insulators, 1 post shifted and tamped. At dawn, he found a calf down in the low pasture, legs folded wrong beneath it. The throat was torn. There were no tracks around the body, only bare earth scuffed smooth, as if something heavy had knelt and leaned close. In a ring around the carcass, the grass had stiffened and darkened. When he touched a blade, it snapped like a dry twig, even though the morning was warm. He dragged the calf to the pit and limed it. The dogs watched with their ears flapped. When he straightened, the smell lifted off of his clothes, metallic, sour. He scrubbed his forearms at the pump before going inside. "Wolves," the old man said from the bedroom. "They don't leave tracks sometimes. Wind scours it clean. Don't overthink it." That evening, John strung more wire and drove 2 new posts along the north line. He mounted cheap motion lights every 40 yards and tied them into the generator circuit. When the sun dropped behind the ridge, the first light warmed to a dull yellow and made the fence look like a pale road running through the dark. Dogs refused to go past the second light. They paced a little, but then lay down in the dirt with their noses pointed at the timber. John walked the entire length with a steady beam and came back without seeing anything but frogs in the ditch and 1 owl on the corner post that didn't fly until he was almost under it. Around 3 that morning, something tapped the barn wall. 3 knocks, slow, measured. Sounded like wood on wood. John stood up from the kitchen table and the dogs came awake at once, nails scraping the floor. When he opened the door, the tapping stopped. He took the lantern and walked to the barn with the rifle over his shoulder. The cattle were quiet. He checked the far stalls and the side door. The locks were good. He smelled hay, oil, and a faint rusty taint that seemed to cling to the far corner where the feed stacks were stacked. He waited there, listening to the air move through the eaves. Nothing knocked. He went back in and kept the lantern on the rest of the night. The next day, he found the same deep scratches on a different fence post. Same height, same 4 grooves. He measured from the top staple to the lowest mark, shoulder high to him. The dust was fresh, clinging to the staple like flour. The old man heard the door slam when John came in and started talking before John said a word. "Don't go up the road to ask about it. Neighbours turn it into legends fast. We've got animals, we fix fences. That's the work." That night brought heat lighting over the ridge and a brief power sag. The generator kicked in and stayed on. The motion lights along the north fence winked, one after another, like something walked the line just out of sight. John stood on the porch and watched them die and come back, as if whatever moved there paused beneath each lamp and then slid on to the next. Scout let out 1 short bark and then shut his mouth like he'd been checked. Brim whined low, nose up, breathing fast. "Quiet," John said. The word felt wrong in his throat. He didn't want to hear his own voice carried across the pasture. He took the rifle and a spare battery for the lantern and walked down the hill. The soil was dry and powdery. His boots raised little ghosts of dust with each step. He told himself to slow down and that he was walking faster anyway. At the second light, something moved at the edge of the beam and stopped. The shape was at the fence, bent over as if examining the wire. John lifted the rifle without thinking and the shape straightened and turned its head towards him. He saw the jacket first, his father's old denim, patched at the elbow. The rest didn't match any person. The arms were too long, the legs were wrong in the joints, the head cocked to one side and held there like the muscles forgot how to work. "John," it called. The voice matched his father's tone well enough to make his stomach drop. "Bring the dogs." The figure stood too still between syllables, as if the sound arrived before the mouth moved. John reached behind him without looking and touched the stock again to feel wood under his hand. "You're not out here," he said, hardly any air behind the words. The porch light burned steady up the hill. The window in his father's room glowed. The figure took one step towards the fence and lowered its head as though it were trying to see him better. Its knees didn't bend right. The wire sang softly as it leaned. "John," it said softer. The dogs growled behind him, fur up, but they did not come down the hill. He fired once, high. The sound cracked the pasture, bounced off trees and came back thin. The figure dropped into a crouch, held there and slid backwards out of the light without turning. John kept the rifle up until the last lamp along the run stopped humming. He walked backwards to the barn and then up to the house with the dogs at his heel. Every step measured, breath shallow. He sat in a chair by his father's bed for an hour before speaking. The old man slept hard, snoring in fits. When dawn finally pushed the dark off the windows, John walked the north fence again. The dirt held no prints, only his own from the night before. The wire near the far post was sticky to the touch. His fingers came away with a faint smear that smelled of pennies. He scrubbed his hands with dish soap until the smell dulled. The day ran long. He checked the herd twice and found nothing but serious movement and a few animals standing with their heads pointed towards the timber. Mid-afternoon, the neighbour called to say he'd heard something crying near his pond the previous night. "Like a man trying to talk through a throat full of mud," the man said, and then coughed and apologised for the image. John didn't repeat the report to his father. He checked the rifle, counted shells, and set the lantern and spare batteries on the kitchen table. He fed the dogs early and clipped their collars to keep them from ranging. By midnight the heat had broken. The air lay flat and wet. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled like a wagon across a bridge. At 1:40, the barn door banged once and swung inwards a few inches. The latch had been set. It shouldn't have moved. The dogs went rigid, ears up. John swept the porch with the beam, then the yard. Then the packed dirt down the hill. The lantern made a halo in front of him and left his back feeling exposed. The cattle bellowed in a low wave. Hooves hit wood. Something slammed the stall door against its frame from the inside. He ran. The dogs followed and then stopped at the barn threshold and couldn't make themselves cross it. They lowered themselves almost to the ground and whined through their teeth. "Stay," he said without turning. He shouldered through the side door and slid the bolt back into place behind him. The lantern lit the dust and wide backs of the cattle pressed tight to the far fence. The smell in the barn was wrong. Animal sharpness laid over by a corded taint like meat forgotten in a drain. His breath fogged the glass for a second when he exhaled too close to the lamp. The far door, the one that opened to the equipment lot, hung crooked on its hinges, as if something had leaned hard against it. The top hinge screws were pulled half an inch out of old wood. Straw packed the gap where the door met the jamb. From behind the hay bales in the centre aisle came a sound like fabric dragging over floorboards, slow, not trying to hide. "Hey," he said, and heard his voice carry and die in the rafters. "Hey," something answered from the other side of the bales in his father's tone. Same pitch, same casual weight. The mouth was wrong on the word, and it trailed half a beat behind the sound. The lantern flickered once and steadied. John raised the rifle and took 3 steps along the aisle. He kept the bales between him and the space beyond. The cattle stamped and swung their heads to follow his light. One animal groaned deep, a sound that vibrated the boards under his boots. The dragging stopped. He heard breath then. Long pause. Air moving through a place it didn't belong. The lantern's flame thinned and wavered in its chimney. "John," the thing said, almost beside him now, not behind the bales at all. The voice came low to the ground, by the feed sacks. "Open the door." His hand moved without orders and shot the bolt on instinct. The door was already shut. He brought the lantern down to the sacks. Something pale and thin pulled back from the edge of the light, too fast for that shape. Fingers long, jointed, dark at the tips, skittered out of sight. The burlap rasped. He fired. The blast filled the barn and rolled out to the open side. Dust leapt. The lamp guttered and hung on. The cattle surged and shoved each other, eyes rolling white. When the smoke cleared, Something lay halfway behind the sacks. It was not flesh in any way he'd learned dressing steers. The surface was too smooth, like bark soaked and softened and stretched over bone too tight to hold shape. Black lines ran along the length like old fissures. The wound he'd made didn't bleed, it steamed and hissed. The thing pulled the length of itself back with a sound like wet rope, and the sacks jumped in a line as it passed behind them. The air got colder in a hush, so fast it took his breath and left his teeth aching. He backed towards the main aisle, rifle up, lamp high. The bales shifted against each other, just slightly, as if something rested a hand there and then took it away. He caught a glimpse around the far edge, a face that wasn't a face, flat in the wrong places, hollow where eyes should be, the mouth opened too wide as if it simply hadn't learned to stop. It moved when his lamp moved, not before. It watched the light, not him. He ran. He didn't remember crossing the threshold, only that the dogs were suddenly beside him again, eyes wild, and that the night outside felt warmer than the air inside had been by a wide margin. He slammed the side door and dropped the heavy bar across it. The dogs fled to the porch without being told. He followed and kept the rifle in his hands until his forearm cramped. The generator chugged once, coughed and steadied. The motion lights along the north fence blinked in a slow ripple and then died again. In the space between those two breaths of light, something moved along the line of posts. Not fast, not slow. Head low like it was scenting the wire itself. On the porch, John listened until the cattle quieted and the dog's breathing evened. He didn't go back to the barn. He went to his father's room at dawn and found the bed empty, covers thrown aside. The window opened 3 inches at the bottom. Cold air moved the curtain a little and then let it fall. There was no sign of struggle. The oxygen tank sat hulking by the nightstand, mask looped over the valve, tubing draped to the floor. The dog stood in the doorway and didn't cross the threshold. John called the sheriff. He walked the house 3 times while he waited and checked the ground below the window. No prints, the soil there was hard as cement from years of foot traffic. The deputies walked the fence line with him and wrote notes about coyotes, bears, and wolves. They looked at the scratches on the post and didn't commit to an opinion. One touched the mark with his knuckle and then wiped his hand on his pant leg when he thought John wasn't looking. By afternoon, neighbours had heard enough to drive out. They stood by their truck with their hands on the rails and said words that didn't land anywhere. One old man asked where the old man's boots were, out of habit. John didn't know and didn't like that he didn't know. He found them himself at dusk, half buried in mud near the equipment gate on the barn's far side. They were on their sides, one toe poking up like a marker. He dug them out with both hands. The leather was damp the way the leather gets when it's been left in dew and forgotten. He brought them to the porch and set them under the bench. At night, the generator ran hard and hot. The porch light sputtered and held. John sat with a rifle as the sky went black and the tree line became a single dark seam. At 1:30, a voice called from the pasture. "John." His father's tone, his father's pace. The word carried cleanly up the slope and struck the house. "Inside," John said to the dogs without looking at them. They didn't move. They stared past him down the hill with their ears laid flat. "John," the voice said again, closer now. "Bring the dogs." He didn't answer. The porch boards were cool through his boot soles. His finger stood on the trigger guard and stopped there. Down by the second motion light, something stood outside the fence. The lamp took a long time to warm, and then it threw a thin oval on the ground that ended at the creature's feet. He could see pale toes through the wire, too many joints in each digit. The skin looked dry and dark at the tips where it touched earth, as if the ground had burned it. The thing lifted its head slowly, like a person trying a movement for the first time. The face that was both too gaunt and too smooth, the holes where eyes should be reflected the light in a dead way. It leaned close to the wire and pressed its mouth open as if to taste the air. "Open the gate," it said in the old man's voice, but the last word broke at the end as if the throat had kinked. "Open." John stood, The dogs took a step back. He sighted on the rifle and fired once. The shot snapped and bucked and died on the pasture like the others had. The light at the fence flickered. The thing lowered itself until it crouched, hands flat on the ground, elbows high. It held there. Then, with a slow motion that never looked like stepping, it slid back into the dark beyond the lamp. He didn't chase. He kept the porch between him and the pasture and cracked the door behind him until his heel hit the stop. He stood like that until the first thin stripe of daylight showed up in the east. The sheriff came back after sunup with 2 more men and a game warden. They found nothing but bent grass and one section of wire at the far north corner with the hooks torn free of the 2 staples. The posts stood intact. The ground didn't give up any prints. They filed the missing person report. They took John's statement twice and asked the same questions 3 different ways and wrote it down both times. A neighbour brought a covered dish he didn't eat. By afternoon, the yard was empty again. John fixed a torn section of fence and added 2 more posts for good measure. He hung an extra light and pushed the span further out into the pasture. The dogs followed him and then retreated without being told when he reached the last lamp. He stayed 1 more night. He didn't trust that he would sleep if he left. The ranch sounded wrong after dark. The generator's rhythm felt like a heartbeat that didn't belong. The cattle didn't lie down all at once. They stood in clusters and watched the tree line. When they did drop, they faced east like something dictated it. Sometime after 2, the wind came steady from the timber and carried a smell with it. Blood gone slightly sour, cold iron, the faint rot of wet wood. The dogs lifted their heads and put them back down, eyes open. The motion lights along the fence blinked once in a wave and then held steady. Nothing crossed. When morning came, John walked the perimeter before the flies woke. Near the far corner, where the ground dipped and held the water after rain, he found a single print sunk into the mud. It wasn't a boot. It wasn't a hoof. It was a human foot, bare, long in the arch and narrow at the heel. The toes too thin and too many joints in each. The whole thing pressed deep enough to show the seam between the toes and the ball. No other marks led to or away from it. It sat there, alone, filling slowly with the sheen of groundwater. He stood over it for a long time without moving. The grass around his boots bent and held. He didn't call anyone. He didn't step closer to get a better look. He turned and walked the fence the other direction and finished the loop, then went up the hill. By noon he had packed a bag and put the keys to the tractor in the kitchen drawer under the rubber bands and twine. He left a note of the neighbour with the feed schedule, the vet's number, and the line that said he would come back when he could, though he didn't know what that meant. He took one last drive around the lad in the old Ford, slow, windows down. The pasture lay bright and ordinary in the midday light. The dogs trotted the fence and pretended nothing had shifted. When he reached the north line again, he stopped the truck and looked towards the trees. Nothing moved. The extra motion light he'd hung ticked as it cooled. He set the truck in gear and rolled back towards the house. In the rear view, fence posts made a neat row. For a second, the second to last post seemed taller, as if something stood behind it and then sat down. He didn't look again. By evening, the yard was quiet. The dishes sat where he left them. The boots under the bench kept their shape. The note on the table held its corner up where the paper curled. The dogs slept in the shade and woke to every sound. The wind came from the timber just after dark and slipped through the wire like it had somewhere to be. No one saw anything cross the pasture that night. No one heard a voice call over the fence. Weeks later, the neighbour would say the herd never settled, even after the weather turned. He would say the dogs refused the north light all winter, and the motion lights there failed one by one without burning out. He would not say what he thought he saw once from his kitchen window, something pale standing at the far corner and watching the house with its head tilted, as if listening. He wouldn't be sure. It was far. The glass reflected his own face. The fences stayed mended, the scratch marks on the posts weathered grey. The single print at the low corner filled with silt and leaves and then with new grass in spring. No one found the old man. The sheriff's report listed wildlife as the likely cause. The file closed in winter. The dogs lived on the porch and kept their eyes on the tree line. When the wind came from the timber, they turned their heads and didn't make a sound. If you've made it this far to the broadcast, thank you for listening. Whether you believe in the Wendigo or not, stories like these remind us that the wilderness still keeps its secrets, and sometimes its debts. If you have a story of your own, something you can't quite explain, you can send it to the email listed below. And if you'd like to hear more from the Midnight Broadcast, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. It helps the stories keep coming. Until next time, keep warm and keep your eyes on the tree line.